Hello, I'm Paul Beckwith. I'm on a roll with my videos as I traverse northern Ontario. So right now I'm north of Lake Huron. I'm about halfway between Sault Ste. Marie and Sudbury along the Highway 17. And I took a little detour north into a small town called Elliot Lake. Now, this town has a huge history as a boom and bust mining town. In fact, it used to be called the Uranium Capitol of the world. At its heyday in about 1960, it supplied roughly 68% of uranium mined in Canada, and that's 24% of the world output from this small town. So it had a very glamorous rise and a bitter fall. And then it had a bit of a revival and then another fall to what it is today, which is basically a retirement community. But there was nothing here really in the early 50s. It's just part of the Canadian Shield. It was just forests and endless lakes with hunting cabins and fishing and so on going on. But then a Toronto prospector, Franc Joubin, in 1953 discovered a uranium ore deposit here. And then everything went crazy, of course, because this was after the end of World War II. And of course, people knew about uranium and the fission process and how it could be, how it was used to develop atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end the World War II with Japan, So anyway, the town was founded in 1955, just a few years after the uranium ore deposit was found. At that time, uranium, it was a mineral with sex appeal. It was considered the fuel for, every school kid knew it was the fuel for atomic energy, which was man's most modern and widely publicized source of power. This is what school kids were taught back in that day. It was the ore of the future. So uranium, it's like sex appeal. It's got glamour. That's what some of the promoters were saying. And the Ontario government fell into this idea, hook, line, and sinker. Okay, so from 1955 to 1960, this place turned into a, incredible planned town. So there were, crescent streets, fluorescent street lighting, thousands and thousands of homes built, split-level homes, apartment blocks, 3 stories, shopping plazas, schools. There was even 2 movie theaters, hotels, churches, hospitals. The Ontario government, put tremendous amounts of money in the infrastructure, building, roads up to the town from the Highway 17 which goes south along Lake Huron. Basically, in 1960, 25,000 people in the town. In 1956, there were 3,791. And in the late 50s and in 1960, 25,000 people in here, and then it dropped off. It roughly halved in 1961 when the initial buzz went off and the uranium contracts decreased. But in the late 50s, people living in this town, they were the best paid workers in Canada. Of the 25,000 people in the town, 9,000 were miners, and the Ontario government was setting up, it was all, the idea was atoms for peace, atoms to build nuclear power, power of the future. There were orders for the mining companies in Elliot Lake had orders for over $1 billion with delivery of uranium between 1957 and 62. And even the pessimistic economists said that uranium would power the world up until at least the 70s. and the more optimistic ones said, basically forever, the 80s. And this was unheard of for mining towns. I mean, mining towns are generally boom and bust. But Elliot Lake had the aura of permanence. The idea was that, this was it. This was the energy source now. This was the energy source of the future. And, there would always be a global demand for uranium. And also the Cold War was going on, so there was a huge demand for uranium to build weapons. But the big push economically was uranium for peace, okay? Unlimited power, cheaper than you could meter, and the whole thing. But this turned, the Canadian government decided they didn't want to sell uranium for weapons. Now that really cut into the demand, and the Ontario government went big into nuclear power generation, and they needed a good supply of uranium, so it kept the town sort of going. But then in 1974, there was a miners' strike. Over 1,000 miners in Elliot Lake went on strike because people were dropping like flies. Many people were getting extremely sick and dying of lung cancer. So the uranium miners, with their health issues from lung cancer and silicosis, demanded that the Ontario government look into uranium mining for miner safety. And up until that point, the Ontario government was saying mining uranium is perfectly safe. There's no problem whatsoever, right? So they were saying this directly to the miners. By 1984, so things took a long time to change, and there was still a lot of demand for miners because there was still uranium demand around the world. So in 1984, 274 uranium workers from Elliot Lake had already died of lung cancer. And not only that, but it became clear that the region's entire population, not only the miners, but anybody else living in the town or working in the town, these people had all been exposed to increased levels of radiation. And the reason being is that they were, in any mining process, you take the ore and you have to extract the mineral from the ore, in this case uranium. So there were large quantities of radioactive rock and tailings that remained from the milling process of the mining. And these tailings still contained about 85% of the original radioactivity, things like thorium-230, radium-226, and other breakdown products, breakdown elements from the fission of the uranium atom. And the radioactivity, specifically the radon released, which is a gas, was from these tailings was 10,000 times more concentrated than that is given off from undisturbed ore. And if the tailings they get into the ecosystem, they become airborne. The radioactive particles become airborne, and they're aquatic, and they're released from the tailings. And not only that, but a lot of the radioactive waste rock was actually used in the construction of homes in Elliot Lake well into the 1970s. So radon gas was a huge problem within these homes. And when you breathe in radon gas, you get it leads to the lung cancer. So the city installed fans under the floorboards to try to ventilate the basements to reduce that problem. Eventually the demand for uranium went down in this location, not because of the overall lack of demand for uranium, but because much more profitable mines were developed in Saskatchewan. So the contracts for Elliot Lake decreased significantly. So basically Ontario uranium mines were decommissioned due to the economic pressures, not due to safety or health, in the early 1990s. Northern Ontario has quite a history for mining. There's silver mines in Cobalt, Ontario. I guess cobalt there as well. Iron ore mines in Temagami, Of course, the famous nickel mines in Sudbury, and I'm heading to Sudbury. I'll be there in a few hours, so I may do a video in front of the big nickel there, talk about nickel mining. Gold in Timmins, and of course the uranium in Elliot Lake. So I guess, so by 1984, 274 uranium workers had already died of lung cancer. And when you compare the death rates of the miners, uranium miners, to control groups, the incidence of lung cancer specifically was almost 3 times higher than control groups, and in some studies even much, much higher. So how many people actually died in the uranium mining in Elliot Lake all through the history? And I can't find those numbers, okay? I try to find epidemiological studies on what's happening today in terms of the people that are living here, and I can't find that information, so I don't know. I guess I have to search a bit deeper, but I'm just going to pan the camera over. So this is a mining memorial where I'm sitting at right here, and there's a list here of names of miners who have died, and there's about 300 names on this list right now, and so it was at least 300. And in this little park that I'm in, there's little plaques all along the ground of the names of miners. And, you know, as you read some of the names, you can see many people, like some family names, you know, there's like 3, 4, 5 people from the same family. They were all miners, and their names are engraved on plaques. And then in the background there's, you can see a structure, which is like, there's a big wheel on top of a wooden structure. It's like a pulley system that was used in the mines. So, you know, we all know that mining is extremely hazardous, but mining uranium was even far more hazardous than other mining. And, you know, it was, you know, we know coal miners, it's often lung diseases where they're inhaling the coal dust. But in the uranium mines, when you disturb the rock and the rock contains uranium, you get radon gas released, and radon gas that you inhale, of course, is a you know, particles get lodged in the lungs and deep inside the lungs and lead to lung cancer. So anyway, that's sort of the legacy of this town. You know, it's been through boom and bust cycles. It's still here. The sign driving in said 11,500 people, but I think that's a little bit dated. I think there's about 10,500 people in the town now. And like I said, it's mostly a retirement community. You know, they have lots of slick ads saying, come and retire in Elliot Lake. You can hunt, you can fish, and, you know, people, it would be interesting to do a survey and to interview people who have retired and live here. And, you know, maybe I wouldn't be surprised if some were even unaware of the history of this mining town. So anyway, you know, what's the climate change angle? You know, some people, you know, say that we absolutely need nuclear energy because it's clean, relatively. You're not burning fossil fuels. You're not burning fossil fuels and creating carbon in the atmosphere. You do create some in the manufacturing process, but, you know, the energy density of uranium is enormous. That's why it's been used in power stations for quite a long time, and that's why it'll continue to be used for quite a long time. But the problem, of course, is the nuclear waste problem. You know, what do we do with the nuclear waste? And of course, in Japan, in Fukushima, they stored it in pools of heavy water, which were very close to the coastline. And of course, when there was the tsunami, it caused a release. It breached a lot of these pools where the spent fuel was stored, and released that radioactivity into the ocean and into the environment on the coast of Japan. Whenever there's a large nuclear accident, then people get up in arms about the power, but, you know, and then after a while, then it quietens down and the power is still generated. I know that governments are looking at small modular reactors to generate power. Again, one has to be very careful, because what does one do with the fuel? And there's always a nuclear proliferation problem. So, renewables are far cheaper, just to go full gung-ho with renewables, and we don't really have that need for nuclear. Okay, thanks for listening.